It's been a horrible month of March for the Fly Guys, who are back in action tonight against the one team who's probably had it worse than them, and yet the Buffalo Sabres would be a welcome sight for most. But Kevin Durso, the way this Flyers team has been playing, I'm not sure that anybody is a welcome sight for this Philadelphia Flyers team. So let's dive into some of the issues this team is having. Although they did get a nice win over the weekend, that's a nice story we'll get to in just a second. But Kevin, what's going on, bud?
What's up, Mike? How you doing?
I'm all well. I'm good. But this team, you know what's funny? About this time a year ago, this team was the team we felt the best about. Here we are 1 year later, and we might feel the worst about this team.
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, this team struggled throughout the month for sure, but it's really not a surprise when you consider the way that they're losing games right now, that they're causing all of their own problems. This is an execution problem, and a lot of it falls on the players. You know, the coaching staff has to do what they can, but again, limited practice time and things like that make it hard to do that. So the players really just need to go out and find a way to make things happen on the positive end, and they're not doing that. They're not cleaning up their mistakes. They're making a lot of the same mistakes. They're really mentally fragile right now. They're a fragile team mentally because of the fact that it seems like the first one goes into the net and it turns into two or three very quickly, and it leads to – they're not losing games by a goal or two most of the time. They're losing games by 3 or 4 goals at different points, and maybe coming back and finding a way to make it look more presentable on the scoreboard, if you will, at the end of the game, but it doesn't cover the fact that they are falling behind so big in these games, digging too much of a hole and not finding a way to climb out of it and stop the bleeding when it starts. Because, you know, and that was the good thing about that Saturday game against the Rangers was they did give up the first goal. They didn't let that get into their heads. They did, it was in a game where it was very much the possibility of here we go again, because it wasn't just any goal. It was a power play goal where the PK had struggled in previous games. It's Zibanejad again. It's the Rangers. Here we go again. And instead they stopped it there and they found a way to get the 2 goals necessary to win that game. But that's the mindset that needs to continue as you move forward, because you continue to dig these holes and that just only puts you at a disadvantage as things move forward.
Kevin, give us the update on what the plan is with Carter Hart. Alain Vigneault talked today. He says he will not play either tonight or Wednesday night. So, I mean, is this a head clearing? What is the feeling about where they stand as an organization with their 22-year-old goalie, who, by the way, has a 4 goals against average right now?
Yeah, so this is really the best opportunity they have to give him some time in season at this point. There's really not much of an option for it because you have so many. March presented so many challenges with back-to-backs and 3 and 4s and things like that realistically they'd come to a point where they would try to use Brian Elliott a couple of times in a row where they could, and ultimately have to go back to Carter Hart because of the fact that the schedule just didn't allow. Unless you're going to run Brian Elliott straight into the ground, which they might have to an extent already, then it didn't allow for you to give Carter Hart that break that I think he needed to clear his head a little bit and to try to just work on things in practice. Instead, they were literally just having to throw him back into a game. Now, first of all, I think the first thing that stood out is this is the first time you've actually heard the name Alex Lyon come into play as a possibility to start a game. Before, Alain Vigneault had kind of denied that as a possibility, said he wouldn't start a game. Now it sounds like it's possible. I think they'll still end up going Elliott for the game on Wednesday, depending on how everything looks tonight, but they'll go that way, I think. And Carter Hart's plan is take these 2 games off, spend the time on the practice rink, working on these issues. You know, you kind of can line up Brian Elliott for not just tonight, but like I said, Wednesday and Saturday as well, because there's some time there. And maybe this gives him a week. I kind of think that at this point in time, based on not only where the team's at, but where Hart is at as well in the season, this is probably the last chance the Flyers have to try to work this out in season without doing something more drastic like sending him to the minors or something like that. Because you're trying your best to kind of keep him in play as much as possible, especially while by all the numbers you're mathematically still very much alive in a playoff race. You're trying your best to keep him involved in this and to see if you can work it out mid-season. But I think that if you don't have success this week and into next week, and Hart's not part of that anyway, then I think you're not only taking yourself out of the playoff picture, but you're giving the option to move him to the minor leagues, and just give him time to work on it at a different level and
Crazy.
see the game differently.
By the way, speaking of the playoffs, I mean, they're in the race, yes, but they are 10 points behind Pittsburgh for third. So it's really between them, Boston, and New York. I guess Jersey would still be kind of within an earshot. But you've essentially got to say you've got to play better hockey than Boston and New York, two teams who have whipped you twice, 3 times, 4 times in the month of March here. So that doesn't make you feel all that good. So with that, what happened to Carter Hart? According to Evolving Hockey, Kevin, this was an article at ESPN.com. Hart has cost the Flyers 3 wins in the standings, an extra 6 points. Here's a guy who's 22, and I've seen people tweeting that, see, Hextall knew what he was doing. You don't want to bring him up too early. This is a guy who came up and had success. So why has he taken such a gigantic step back?
Well, for one, I think the defensive play contributes to that because he's forced to be put into situations where he has to be desperate to make saves, and it can knock your positioning off because you have to be prepared for that desperation save, and even then he's not getting over fast enough. The article notes something really specific about his game that I've picked up on as well because it makes him smaller in net. He's dropping too early to his knees. He's positioning himself to go down way too early on these opportunities, and that's why scorers are beating him to the glove side high constantly because he's giving that to them, and that's kind of the book on him right now. And teams pick up on this stuff. This is exactly what the lack of practice time presents for everybody else around the league and in the division specifically, since that's everybody that the Flyers are playing this year. It presents time to look at video and see that this is what he's doing, this is what his tendencies are, so go attack that, and that's exactly what teams are doing. But a lot of it does have to do with the team in front of him as well. I mean, they're giving up a lot of high-danger scoring chances. They're putting him in a position where he has to be heroic to make saves, and that doesn't help either. So that gets into your head, and I do think that part of it, again, is the mentality of it. You let one in, it gets into your head, and because he's young, it can really get out of control really quickly. And, chances are at 22 years old, he's probably never struggled like this at any level in his life. So he's learning how to deal with adversity as well, and that's something that takes some time as well. So all of those factors go into it, but this is really just, it's not just like it was a drop-off in numbers here. This is really staggering what's happened to him.
Kevin, how surprised were you to hear what Fletcher said the other day when he essentially came out and said the makeup of this team is not good? And I'm thinking to myself, okay, that seems obvious to watch. But wasn't this the same team essentially that you had all these good vibes about just 1 year ago?
Yeah, for sure. And for one, I do appreciate his honesty in that because, I would have much preferred an answer like that as I did over trying to spin this in some positive way because everybody can see what's happening. Everybody can see the struggles. Everybody can see how the mentality's fragile. Everybody can see the mistakes that are constantly being made. And once you get to a certain point like they were within the last week or so where you're at the halfway point of your season, it defines who you are as a team. And to hear him say that kind of opens some eyes because it says now that, it goes back to what I had said before last season had started when Fletcher was still relatively new. It was going into his second full season as GM. Alain Vigneault was brand new. And the point was you have a new coach and you have a relatively new GM, and they're not going anywhere anytime soon. So if the struggles continue, and that kind of carried into this year, if anything goes the wrong way, it's going to be a player issue, and it's going to be recognized as a player issue. And that was kind of the admission that people, I think, were looking for, that there's a recognition that something's not right here, and it's more than just the departure of a guy like Matt Niskanen. It's way bigger than that, and they have to figure this out, and it's a tough environment to figure it out because there's not a lot of action going on. There's a few trades being made, but they're very minimal at best, and you're trying to make significant changes, and it just doesn't seem like the atmosphere is there for it. So who knows where they're going to be able to turn to find a way to make it better. They might just have to mentally get it together and figure it out in that sense. And that's why I said you got to take away the fragility of how mentally unstable you can be in these games, and especially these next two, because Buffalo is probably the only team out there in the league that may be more fragile than you are right now because you've lost 17 straight games. Find a way to keep that going, because if you can find a way to keep their losing ways going, you can get 4 points out of this thing. Doesn't matter how you do it, and at least keep yourself involved in the race and maybe some positive vibes going because you'll have won 3 in a row.
Kevin Durso covers the Flyers for 97.3 ESPN.com. They play Buffalo tonight, and a lot of times, especially in the NHL, it is not odd to see the coach get let go very quickly into his tenure. I've seen people all of a sudden start to say, you got to fire this guy, fire that guy, fire everybody. Would Alain Vigneault, in your opinion, be part of this problem?
No, not to me. I don't think he's part of the problem. I mean, look, everybody, when you have struggles the way that they've had, and when you're losing a game 9-0 or 8-3 or anything of that sort, those games and those sequences when it's put together, whether, losing streaks, whatever, everybody's part of the problem in some way, shape, or form. But I don't think you can pass the buck any further here. This is a team that's gone through these kind of, on again, off again playoff appearances, 1 year in, 1 year out, 1 year good expectations, 1 year low and at the bottom of the food chain when it comes to the NHL. You can't keep going back and forth and then continue to pass the buck. In the last 10 years, they've had 5 head coaches. And if you do this again, you say it's Alain Vigneault's fault, he's out, then you're just continuing to move the problem down the line and you're not really addressing it, in my opinion. So I think he's still too early in his time as head coach anyway to be a thought of this. Maybe you do give some consideration to the assistant coaching staff a little bit here, and you say maybe you change up one assistant here or there, and maybe that sparks something. But I definitely wouldn't touch the head coaching situation right now. I don't think it's on him, and I don't think doing anything to that will really change anything in the long-term future.
Obviously, you mentioned trades, and the trade deadline is coming up, for the NHL. You would imagine if the Flyers think that they're in this, they've got to be making calls for defensemen, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Chuck Fletcher said as much. He's making as many calls and he's been on the phone as much as he has in any year he's been doing this. I think one of the struggles now is, and a great example is the team that we've heard most linked to the Flyers when it comes to trade possibilities. The Nashville Predators just climbed their way back into a playoff spot yesterday. And that just goes to show you how quickly you can go from being a team that's thinking about selling off different assets, whether it's Matthias Ekholm, Ryan Ellis, whatever, the names that have been linked to the Flyers previously. Now they're in a playoff spot, and they could be in the playoff picture, and that can change the mindset of a GM for another team. And that might be the only thing that the Flyers can do to control anything themselves at this point, is to actually work on what they on this season with what they have. And it's not the answer everybody's looking for, because I think people think it's going to go a certain direction. I tend to agree with that, because maybe this week you're going to get on a little bit of a roll because Buffalo is what they are at this point. But you got the Islanders on Saturday. You got a back-to-back with Boston to start next week. And from there, just a brutal schedule in terms of opponent. Maybe not necessarily as brutal as this month's with the timing between games, but definitely a brutal schedule in terms of opponents. And it can knock you out quicker than anything. So it could, and the timing couldn't be worse either, because you're quite possibly going to go into next week, that first full week of April, playing Boston 3 times, maybe right there with them, maybe still 3 points back, maybe 1 point back, who knows? And you'll think you have a shot. And if you lose one of those games, 2 of those games, doesn't really matter. You might knock yourself right out with that. And then it might be too late to change course and try to figure out the best way to make improvements for the long term at the trade deadline. So this is really a fine line the Flyers are walking in terms of where everybody else in the league is going to stand, but where they stand as well, because they could still be hanging around the playoff picture right as the deadline hits, and they have to make a call. And if they, it's going to be tough for them to make that call if they're still just within a couple of points of the playoff spot, when realistically it's not going to be a pretty outlook.
Well, and you wonder if people are looking at their roster and saying, "Hey, you got guys that can help us. You're gonna have to balance that as well."
Absolutely, and I think that's the decision they have to make. But that's where I say there's a bit of a problem with that, is if you still think you have a shot at the playoffs, you're going to be a little bit more stingy about who you give away too. And then you're going to have to try to correct course and see if you can do anything. And try doing that in the last weekend before the deadline. And then teams are going to hold you to a new standard. You might not be able to make any change at all, or you're going to get very little back in return and still feel like you have to make that trade to just part ways with somebody because you want to obtain more assets and more draft picks or more prospects or whatever. And that's not necessarily going to be the best way to go if you're not getting back what you think you fully deserve for these guys. So that's really the challenge that they face.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to April 12th, by the way. 3 o'clock, April 12th is the NHL Trade Deadline. That's on Monday. So you will, of course, have about 2 weeks left to go before that happens. We could learn where they are within the 2 weeks. As you just mentioned, what they have coming up for them. You got Boston a couple times in that mix. The Islanders have kind of had your number. And they got Boston twice. The Islanders, actually Boston 3 times before the trade deadline. That could, you're right there with them. That could give you all your answers right there. Kevin Durso, covers the Flyers at Kevin_Durso. Flyers in Buffalo tonight. Actually, the game is here, right?
No, it's in Buffalo this time around.
Right the first time. Flyers in Buffalo tonight. And Kevin Durso, of course, does a great job covering the Flyers at 97.3 ESPN.com. And he, like all guests, appear via the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. All right, good to see you, bud.
Great to see you, Mike. Thanks for having me.